The Weekly Hugh Demon. Full steam ahead.
Episode 22. My son Jack is 22 years old. Maybe I'll dedicate this episode to him. Of course, there's really nothing about Jack in this episode, although I do talk quite a bit about gin and tonics. So, and he likes a stiff drink, so... Reminds me of a Christmas break. I was mixing drinks for people, and I gave one of my sons straight gin over ice. And didn't tell him. He took a drink and tried to keep a straight face. It's pretty funny. Anyway, we have a good show today. I'm doing probably about a 7-minute overview of the Old Testament. Going to try to jam about 1,500 years of history. Try to give you a good roadmap when you read the Old Testament. I'm going to do my last segment on deconstructionism. Yes, it'll be a continuing theme, but this will be probably the last segment that I actually dedicate to that subject. I also got a couple other things you're gonna like. Got a real fun lightning segments. As always, thanks for listening. All right, I've had 2 requests from steady listeners to give an historical overview of the Old Testament. Both people have said, I start reading the Old Testament or even trying to comprehend Old Testament type things. I have no context. I have no mental bearings. I'd love to have like an overview, kind of like you gave of the Middle Ages, way back at the beginning of this podcast series. So I'm going to do it. I'm going to try in this segment to summarize about 1,500 years into about 5 minutes. The attempt here is not to eliminate your gaps in your understanding of Old Testament times. The intent here is to create gaps. Because right now I think a lot of people out there, when they think Old Testament, the whole thing is one great big gap. My goal here is to give you landmarks, chronological landmarks, to give you your bearings, and you can fill in the gaps as certain topics interest you. So, but before we start, I want to clarify one thing. This is not a theological overview. This is an historical overview. It's not supposed to be Catholic, Jewish, or anything like that. It's not supposed to be anti-Catholic, anti-Jewish. This is supposed to be just the history as we accept it in the Christian tradition. So, we're going to start with Abraham. Go back to Noah and all that. You get shrouded in complete mystery. Abraham, definitely a shadowy figure. We just don't know much about him, to say the least. But we do know Israel history pretty much starts with him, with the idea of a promised land and a covenant. Those 2 crucial things start with Abraham. He gave birth to a son named Isaac. Isaac then had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. Jacob got the blessing. God changed his name to Israel. He had 12 sons. This is Joseph and the amazing Technicolor raincoat type thing. And according to the biblical tradition, Joseph was sold into captivity. He was taken to Egypt. His brothers then went there during the famine. He still loved them even though they had sold him into slavery. And that's how that's how the Israelites came to Egypt, and that started the Egyptian captivity. And now we start getting to kind of historical times. Again, not that historians agree, but not by any stretch. A lot of people even question whether Moses existed or not. But at least we now start getting some historical bearings. And these bearings are 1650 to about 1200 BC. Or you might see it called BCE. BC is before Christ. Its secular counterpart is before the Common Era. AD refers to Anno Domini, Year of Our Lord. We live in the AD times, and in contemporary historical writings, they call it CE, Common Era. So anyway, around 1200, 1220, you have Moses rise up, and he takes the Israelites out of Egypt. That's the book of Exodus. And you may recall, Exodus talks about how Moses didn't like the ways people were being oppressed. Pharaoh at one point actually ordered all the kids of, all the newborns of Israel be killed by the midwives because they're proliferating so quickly. That's that kind of humorous story where the midwives couldn't bring themselves to kill the babies. And when Pharaoh called them and said, what what the heck are you doing? Why aren't you killing these kids? They said, oh, these Hebrew women are so strong. They're giving birth faster than we can kill them, basically. Which kind of reminds me of that old Polish joke, and please excuse, the racist notion of this, or whatever you call it. It reminds me of that old Polish joke. Polish statesmen are gathered together to talk about the overpopulation problem. And one of the men stood up and said, "Gentlemen, we have an overpopulation problem. Our studies show that a Polish woman gives birth to a new baby every 30 seconds. Our job is to find this woman and stop her." Again, my apologies if you're offended by Polish jokes. I actually told them all the time growing up, because of my immense respect for John Paul II and my awareness that Polish jokes really have kind of denigrated the Polish people unfairly. They might be some of the smartest people out there, quite frankly. When you look historically, they're possibly some of the greatest people and possibly some of the most intelligent people, and they're Europe's last best hope right now too. You want to see something great going on in Europe, ignore all of Europe, focus on Poland. Anyway, back to the text, so to speak. About this time that Moses takes the Israelites out of Egypt and takes them back to the Promised Land, Palestine, Canaan, that's the time of probably the Trojan War, if you want to get your bearings. That is the heroic age in Greece. Try to get a parallel there. So, Joshua and the Israelites, they retake the Promised Land, Palestine, Canaan. They are then ruled as a loose confederation of the 12 tribes, and they're overseen by the judges. They had no king. They just had judges that took over basically in times of war. Samson was a judge. This continues until around 1000, the Israelites, they demand a king. They go to Samuel and they say, "You have to give us a king to rule over us." And this is, by the way, gives spawn to one of the greatest passages in literature, and definitely in the entire Old Testament, according to libertarians. Samuel goes back to Israelites and says, "You don't want to do this. I've talked to God, and he told me to tell you this. Quote, the king will take your sons and make them serve with his chariots and horses, and they will run in front of his chariots. Some he will assign to be commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and others to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and so others to make weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your friends and vineyards and olive groves and give them to his attendants. He will take 1/10 of your grain and of your vintage and give it to his officials and attendants." And he goes on basically saying, you don't want government over you. You have a loose government with the judges. You don't want it. You don't want a centralized power in a king. But they got it. And it was King Saul. This ushered in the great era of Israel history. Saul, David, Solomon. Those are the only 3 kings Israel had as a unified country. Solomon was kind of a bastard. He ruled with a very heavy hand. When he died, the people came to Rehoboam, his successor, and said, "Hey, lighten up, will ya? Take some of these tax burdens off us." And Rehoboam, being the cocky kid of Solomon, doubled down and said, "No, screw you. I'm going to do it even worse." Well, 10 tribes left, and they formed the kingdom of Israel, and then 2 tribes stayed back, and they had the kingdom of Judah. This then ushers in what I call the prophet era, from like 900 BC to about 589. This is the era of Jonah, Israel, Ezekiel, Elijah, Elisha, Jeremiah, famous Amos, all these people. They're in that era. This bifurcated kingdom arrangement, Israel to the north, Judah to the south, continues until 721, when Israel falls to the Assyrians. The Assyrians are freaking ruthless. They pretty much cart all the people away. They leave a couple behind, but for the most part, the 10 tribes of Israel are taken. If you've heard literary references to the lost tribes of Israel, that's this. The 10 tribes are scattered, taken to Syria, pushed other parts of the world, or other parts of the Middle East. Assyria repopulates the area with different peoples. That was their way of population control, to keep control of the areas they conquered. And this also then gives rise to the story of the Good Samaritan. Because Assyria brought in all these other peoples to mingle with the Jews that stayed behind, the religion got watered down. And so Judah, where Jerusalem was located, they looked down their nose at old Israel, Samaria. and they're lesser Jews, or watered down Jews, and again, just looked down upon. Even, 750 years later when Christ was there, he told the story about the Good Samaritan. That comes from this momentous year of 721 when Israel was crushed. Anyway, Judah continues with the two tribes, Joseph and Benjamin. They continue until 589, and then they're crushed by the Babylonians. That ushers in the Babylonian exile for about 60 years. Then the Persians conquer the Babylonians. Persians are pretty benevolent rulers for that time. You may have seen the movie 300, that the Persians were talking about here. So they may have seemed pretty ruthless in 300, but for the time, they're pretty civilized and kind, compared, again, relatively speaking to the time and age. They let the Jews go back. They said, go back to your land. That was around 530 or so. This condition goes on for quite a few years until Persia falls to Alexander the Great. Again, to give you some context, Alexander the Great, his father was taught by Aristotle, who was taught by Plato, who was taught by Socrates. Socrates died in 399. For some reason, everyone can remember that date for Socrates. Alexander the Great, amazing general. He conquered pretty much everything from Greece to India. He died in his 30s. Died of a massive hangover, apparently. I can commiserate at times. He left no successor, so his kingdom was divided among 4 generals. The general Seleucus, he took over the area of Palestine, Cana, thereby establishing the Seleucid dynasty. And it was the Seleucid dynasty that the Maccabees then revolted against. And that pretty much brings you right up to the eve of Christ. The Seleucids were conquered then by the Romans, who they then controlled at the time of Christ. So, anyway, that's a quick summary. 10 minutes it took. Sorry about that. I wanted to keep it to about 5 or 6, but hopefully, if I hadn't told that Polish joke, or given that libertarian anecdote, probably could have kept it that ways. Anyway, hope you enjoyed it. One of my little pleasures is reading, because you call them books of just weird words that no one uses anymore. I get a big kick out of it. One of the best ones is a book called The Velvet Tongue. You can find it used, and it's pretty cool. It comes, the whole thing is, the cover's all velvet. It's a pretty cool book. Anyway, over the years, I've accumulated quite a few words I really like. I'm going to give you a couple here, and I'll use them in a sentence. Crapulous. It means relating to drunkenness or the drinking of alcohol. Used in a sentence, give me the crapulous, never the serious. There's lissophobia. That's a fear of rabies so extreme that the sufferer manifests symptoms of the disease. The sentence, let's hope there's nothing like lissophobia for fear of homosexuals. Misopedia. Hatred of children, especially one's own. Sentence, as a father of 7 small children, misopedia disgusts me, but I understand it. That's like that old Sam Kinison line talk about spousal abuse. He's like, no, I don't condone wife abuse. I understand it, but I don't condone it. By the way, quick correction. The book is not called The Velvet Tongue. It's called The Gilded Tongue. I did that last segment after 2 gin and tonics, so you'll forgive me. Alright, you hear that? That's the sound of me smiling. Got myself a big gin and tonic here, and I'm getting ready to do some drunken podcasting. Nah, I'm not going to be drunk, really. I mean, definitely nothing close to mortal sin, but definitely relaxing with a couple. To be honest, when I started this podcast, I envisioned myself doing a lot more drinking when I did the podcasting, hence that introduction from that Sam Elliott type sounding guy. Sometimes drunk, often sober, or whatever it says. I thought I'd do a lot more drinking and podcasting than I have. So far I've only done little bits, but here we are on a Friday night. Maria's out of town for a while, so I got my favorite gin and tonic concoction, and I'm talking at you. So what is the ideal gin and tonic? Well, that depends what you want. But to me, it's 6.8 ounces of Fever Tree tonic combined with a giant shot of Bombay Sapphire, like shot and a half, over ice, obviously. You can add a lemon, that'll top it off, but if you want that ideal gin and tonic, that's what you want. Now, that's a pretty expensive gin and tonic. The Fever Tree, the 6.8 ounce bottle will probably cost you $1.50 or $2, compared to like 99 cents for 2 liters of Faygo tonic. And then obviously the Bombay Sapphire is pretty expensive. You're bucking up against $50 for a half gallon. One thing about the Bombay Sapphire, though, is it's 47% alcohol, so you're looking at 94 proof. I wouldn't mind doing a podcast dedicated to nothing but drinking, but as a practical matter, I'm just not that much of a drinker. Yes, I did write The Adventures of Beer Man, and if you haven't downloaded it yet, go to Amazon. It's the best 99-cent book in the world, The Adventures of Beer Man. It's a novella. I forget, it's like 30,000 words. It's a very short book, and again, I don't think it's technically even a novel. It's a novella. It's about a man who metamorphizes into a superhero whenever he drinks, and he brings joy to people around him. So go check out The Adventures of Beer Man. I actually got some decent reviews from people who know what they're talking about. It could have used a good editor. I'm not gonna lie, but I worked hard on it. So this is what you see there. That's totally just me. No one did anything to help me with it, or no editing. So it's a fun book. I went back and read it years after I wrote it, and I was like, I'm not embarrassed. So it's not bad. I've mentioned before how I like Joseph Epstein. Ran across this great quote from his book Snobbery. Yeah, he's talking about Ira Gershwin. If you're Ira Gershwin, it's like you are the man. Everyone wants to be near you. But he was a pretty modest guy. He went out with he and his wife and another couple, and he said, "I will see if they have a table for us." They came back and said, "I'm sorry, they're booked. They don't have a table for us." So his friend said, "Let me go try." Friend came back 5 minutes later and said, "They got a table for us." And Ira Gershwin said, how'd you pull that off? He goes, "Simple. I told them I'm Ira Gershwin." A great Pablo Picasso quote: "I'd like to live as a poor man with lots of money." Pablo Picasso, he is Spanish. I'm assuming he was raised Catholic. That funny little sentence is just dripping with Catholic sentiment. Catholicism, it doesn't condemn money. It just condemns the love of money. The root of all evil is not money. It's the love of money. Pablo Picasso is saying there is kind of the flip side of that. So I want to be detached from the money, but I want lots at the same time. It's funny, but poignant at the same time. I've written quite a few books. None of them published. Except for The Adventures of Beer Man, I self-published that. That Amazon service, by the way, is really cool. You can even pay to have your book edited, from what I understand. The one book I started working on, I never finished it. It probably only got to like 10% of the way finished, but it was my best working title. It was called Stumbling Towards Saintliness with a Beer in My Hand. Non-fiction writer Nick Hornby writes about biographers who are, quote, so sweetly devoted, unquote, to the subject that they can't recognize flaws as flaws. He cites a Dylan Thomas biographer who went to great pains to explain the genius behind an awkward rhyme in one of Thomas's poems. It just didn't rhyme, but the biographer is trying to justify it. And then Hornby says, quote, the notion that Dylan might have just thought, "Oh, F it, that'll do," never occurs to him, unquote. I'm not sure what the big fuss is about Jacques Derrida's conclusions. And that's when I go through like 3 of his conclusions that he came to, and I'm gonna take the position that they're not that radical, and they actually have historical precedent, and in my own personal experience, I kind of come to similar conclusions. And again, I'm not trying to take anything away from Derrida. It's kind of neat the way he got these conclusions, but I think in the grand scheme of things, they're not that remarkable. First, his idea is if you put words in a microscope and really analyze them, they start to break down, and they can't carry meaning. Words are not nearly as robust as we think. Alright? Well, to be honest, I'd kind of semi-consciously came to this conclusion years ago. Whenever I had to do an examination of conscience, I always came across the 8th commandment and, asked myself, have I always told the entire truth? And I remember being frustrated. I'd think back to earlier that day or a week earlier and thinking to myself, that wasn't entirely accurate. Especially if I was talking about someone else. I felt really bad about it. Was it slander? Because this wasn't 100% accurate. And I remember finally coming to the conclusion, maybe I should just never talk at all. Because no matter what I say, when I think back on it, I came to the conclusion that just wasn't accurate. And I felt like I may have kind of lied. Even when I give out legal advice, I really, really try hard to choose my words and be 100% honest with my client. But I came to the conclusion it's just impossible to say everything and to convey fully accurate information. Well, that's kind of what Derrida came down to. And it's probably because words, as Derrida points out, in their nature just cannot convey full meaning. And I'm not the only person to have come to this conclusion. There's a book by George Steiner, the literary critic, called Language and Silence. You can tell by that juxtaposition, language and silence, where he's going with this. He at one time notes in the book, quote, the Western tradition also knows transcendences of language towards silence. Saying that the Western tradition in general has repeatedly come to the conclusion silence is preferable to language, because language just can't do it all, and maybe can't do much at all. And I point you to the Trappists, monks, the works of St. John of the Cross. They're testaments to this idea. How many times has the mystic emerged from a trance, and all the mystic can do is just shake his head, or her head? Doesn't know what to say. There are instances of mystics emerging from their trances, and they're starry-eyed or dumbfounded, and can't speak. I'd also point you to one of the most wordy, I shouldn't say wordy, that's an insult, but one of the most prolific Christian writers in history, St. Thomas Aquinas. If you recall, he ended his life in complete silence. Joseph Pieper, the German philosopher, wrote a book called The Silence of St. Thomas, because St. Thomas had a vivid, vigorous, mystical experience. And after that, he said, everything I've written is straw, and he didn't write another word. Clearly, what he saw transcended anything he could articulate in words, and he could articulate very well. So, again, I'm not that stunned by what Derrida said in that regard. Second point, Derrida talks about there's nothing outside the text. And people debate what he meant by this, but I think all Derrida was saying is, you need context. Without context, the text means nothing. Again, I experienced this in my personal life. I don't know what happened, but on my Kindle, a book was downloaded. And I didn't know what it was. And it was kind of interesting. I didn't click above to find out what the title, nothing. I just started reading it. And I read for over an hour. It was like 10, 20, 25 pages. And I'm just like, what the frick am I reading here? I was just totally baffled as to what was going on. And I had an idea, something about shipping or something. It turned out to be Isabel Patterson's book, The God of the Machine. And maybe she's a difficult writer, I don't know. All I know is I wasn't getting anything out of it without knowing what I was getting into. So I think Derrida has a good point there. I'd also point out, I think we all know this is true. Without context, you can't know anything. I would urge you to go check out Orestes Brownson's The American Republic. He talks about, the founding of government. He points out that before you have a written constitution, there's an unwritten constitution, or an organic constitution, or what he calls a providential constitution that underpins the constitution itself. He said that the written constitution of the United States was just that, the written constitution that embodied norms and truths that we'd already come up with. It wasn't a radical document. We already had the Constitution, in our hearts or in the soul of our country. And then we'd put it down to words. If you lose that tradition that the Constitution came from, the Constitution becomes merely text. And if you don't believe me, Just look at the decisions of the Warren Court from the 1960s. People say, "Oh, they shredded the Constitution." Well, I would say no. The Constitution was shredded as soon as we lost the context. It's historical context, because by itself, the Constitution can be interpreted to mean pretty much anything. And the third thing that Derrida attacked were the binaries. Again, I've hit this many times because I think it's one of the simplest things to understand in Derrida. Again, binaries in the Western tradition, according to Derrida, we've always posited a good ideal, like good, and a bad ideal on the opposite, or an anti-ideal, bad, or male-female, homosexual, or heterosexual, homosexual. The one term is always favored. It is defined by its ugly stepsister on the underside. And Derrida attacks that, say those are just cultural presumptions. Well, the whole concept that binaries are bad, I think someone got to that like 2,500 years before Derrida. It was Lao Tzu and the Taoists. You may recall my discussion Taoism, sayings like, "I didn't hate until I loved." For the Taoists, you don't hate or love. You just be. You just look. That's the Zen tradition as well. They don't want you to look at binaries. They want you to get rid of anything that's dualistic. It is the tradition of mindfulness in the Buddhist tradition, which I think the tradition of mindfulness, the whole practice of mindfulness, could just be radical non-judging. Don't judge anything. If you're truly mindful in the Buddhist tradition, there is no good or bad. There just is. So again, I don't find Derrida particularly radical in that regard. Although I do think I am interested in this. I just have a very sketchy notion of that. Through Taoism and the practice of Zen, you could possibly reach the deconstructionists. Not the Antifa type deconstructionists, but maybe the more peaceful deconstructionists. Maybe you can reach them through Zen or Taoism and maybe establish a common bridge. I'm not terribly hopeful, but I think it might be possible. Alright, that's a wrap. Check out the Twitter feed, check out the Facebook page, go to udemonpodcast.com for show notes and other information. As always, thanks for listening.